everyone, and welcome to our final and last lecture video of the semester. It has been nice sort of interacting with you through virtual these virtual videos, right? Today I do want to do sort of a brief overview of a lesson on class, race, gender, and identity that are in tropes and themes that are seen of these like 4 topics within literature, right? And so it's just gonna be a brief overview, nothing too long. I don't want the video to be too long and too extensive. Just want to give you a little things to think about as you go on to formulate what you want to talk about in your own final exam essays. So I first want to start with, of course, class. And there's been a lot of themes of class, but the one that I want to talk about the most is sort of the poor, underprivileged guy with the falls in love with wealthy girl trope that kind of happens a lot of times in literature. I don't know if anybody knows The Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, but that sort of deals with it with Pip and Estella. So Pip is this sort of course, he is our poor guy who sort of catches a break when this mysterious benefactor sets him up with like an apprenticeship and some money and stuff like that. And then when he sees Estella, the beautiful, wealthy, rich girl who's like born into money, you know, he says he's determined that he's going to work his way up in order to be good enough for her, because she constantly sort of digs it, you know, sort of like shoves him to the side and dismisses him as like, oh, he's poor. Also, The Great Gatsby, I know you have probably read that as well, which is another, again, our poor guy falls in love with rich girl. Jay Gatsby falls in love with Daisy Buchanan when they were kids, but of course she could never bring herself to marry somebody that is low class, right? And so Jay does all of these things to sort of like be good enough for her and win her affections. You know, he acquires all this wealth, and essentially still that is not good enough. Jay is kind of new money, right? Jay is kind of new money, and she's into the old money. And also within these tropes of like these classes tropes within literature that we see, there's also this idea of like, what would you choose kind of question that happens. Will they choose the money or will they choose the love? And most times it's always the money. Getting into themes around race, mostly when we talk about themes around race, we have to talk about a little bit at least about like white people writing about other racial groups, right? Like this is going all the way back to like Shakespeare with Othello and also The Tempest. So Othello, if you haven't read that, of course, is about an African man who sort of enters into like, I think it's Italian society, right? Like Italy, like he's this like major general. People are kind of jealous of him and stuff like that. They make comments about his skin color, all this stuff. And then The Tempest deals with an actual, sometimes it's played as African, sometimes it's played as like African native versus like Native American. There is played both ways sometimes depending on the production company, wherever they want to go with it, but essentially deals with a character named Caliban who was enslaved due to like colonization. It's funny because a lot of like Shakespeare fans laud him as being very progressive in writing these characters, and don't get me wrong, he does deal with some like progressive issues like prejudice and stuff like that, and of course colonization. At the same time, he always makes sure to make sure our black characters in the play and shame and like just like shame and disgust pretty much is how they both end in those plays. So like, I guess progressive for the time maybe, but not exactly the most progressive characters that we could ever see. And you see that happen with a lot of other white writers as well that try to write about race. Joseph Conrad comes to mind, William Faulkner comes to mind, Harper Lee comes to mind. But I do want to move ahead in time into the 1920s when we get really the Harlem Renaissance, this black renaissance of black writers coming together to sort of say this is going to be sort of the first like black explosion of creative work where we are writing about ourselves and our own experiences, and nobody's writing about us, but we're writing about our own experiences, right? And not even that is completely like absent of like, you know, some faltering ideas, right? So the Harlem Renaissance, of course, is the godfather is seen as Langston Hughes. If you ever read any Harlem Renaissance pieces in your Harlem Renaissance novels, you'll see that a lot of the material sort of surrounds like mixed and biracial characters, usually always that takes place up in the north, somewhat usually New York or something like that. And the purpose of that was to like biracial and mixed characters at the time were seen as like bridging a gap between white and black worlds, right? And so like black writers focused on that because they sort of wanted to bridge the gap between white people and black people to sort of come to an understanding. So they used sort of like the biracialness of actual people, and sort of made their characters around that, shaped their characters around that as a way to sort of bridge these two worlds together, right? Zora Neale Hurston was one who sort of called out a lot of Harlem Renaissance writers for always talking about black people in the North, black people who are wealthy, black people of a certain social class and social status, because it was also seen as like she saw it as like like a lot of the writing seemed classist to her as well. So she called them out. So she was one person that called a lot of, and she wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God, but she called out a lot of Harlem Renaissance writers at the time for like being classist, being racist, being colorist, and stuff like that. Moving to the Black Arts Movement, which happens in the 1970s, 60s, where like people like Amiri Baraka are dealing with. They see like the Harlem Renaissance as like, okay, it was a good start, but they weren't aggressive enough. The Harlem Renaissance writers weren't aggressive enough. We need to be more aggressive in our writing. Our writing needs to be more unapologetically black, needs to be more antagonistic and more aggressive. And you know, if you're not being aggressive, then what are you doing? Like, it needs to be, you know, sort of steeped in like politics, because the goal should be freedom. And so how you're going to get liberation by being meek and like timid and stuff like that. And so like people like Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez and stuff like that, and they were really like, definitely they felt like the Harlem Renaissance era was a very nice era of black art. But also surrounding that as well, we get like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, who were born close to that time during the Harlem Renaissance, but then like they started writing later on, also like influenced by the Black Arts Movement and stuff like that. And though they're not as aggressive, well, no, that's not true, they do have aggressive pieces, but then other pieces deal with like definitely like black family. They wanted to focus more on like black families and things of that nature. Of course, they delved in, like James Baldwin delved in more to politics than Toni Morrison did. But yeah, like Toni Morrison had this whole idea of decentering white people in her work, essentially saying like, I just want to deal with black people and that's it in my work. I want to deal with black families, I want to deal with black communities, and I want to deal with what happens in those communities and stuff like that. So that's sort of the progression, and she just passed away not too long ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, actually. I think her most notable work is Beloved, which was the first novel by a black artist writer to win the Nobel Prize. Going into gender and identity, I put these two things together. But gender, so we're talking about women, and we're talking about women, how women are depicted in media and literature, and usually and typically in media and literature, women have always sort of been associated with like the main goals of our female characters have always been centered around their associations with men and also getting married. And yeah, and sort of when women ever sort of when our women characters ever move away from that, they usually weren't depicted in a good light. So going back to Shakespeare again, The Taming of the Shrew. You haven't seen Taming of the Shrew, hopefully you've seen 10 Things I Hate About You, which I can never remember the actress' name, but I know Heath Ledger's in it as well. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's in it. A lot of like famous teen stars that grew up to be pretty famous are in it. But Taming the Shrew deals with this family. We have Bianca and we have Catherine and Kate and their father. And Catherine is seen as like, she's the oldest, and she's seen as like the most hard-headed one. She's not really interested in getting married. This is a Shakespeare play. She's not interested in getting married, and so she's sort of depicted as this sort of shrewish woman, a woman who is non-agreeable, essentially. She does not acquiesce to men. These are not necessarily bad characteristics, of course, now in our 2022 mind frame. But of course, they were seen as bad back during Shakespeare's time. So a woman who does not like listen to men and just let men talk when men are speaking, you know, and she's be quiet or stuff like that. And she wasn't like that. And so she was portrayed as a shrew who needed to be tamed. And how, so essentially, Bianca is sort of the like agreeable woman in this, her younger sister, and she wants to be married, and she has a lot of suitors who want to marry her. But their father says that Bianca cannot get married until Kate gets married first. And so then it's sort of like the whole play is centered around trying to find some crazy man, you know, crazy man, who will marry Bianca and tame her into being an agreeable woman. And so he kind of does abusive stuff to her. I forget the guy's name that she ends up being tamed by, but he ends up like starving her and like verbally abusing her and stuff like that. And then at the end of the play, she becomes agreeable, even more agreeable than other women like her sister. And when she starts to admonish, the last scene is her admonishing her sister and other women at the wedding for not listening to their husbands. Very interesting play, very problematic play. 10 Things I Hate About You, if you go watch the movie, cleans all this up though. So in this as well, like women characters who divvy away from being associated with men or being like good girls or good women, right? Good women, is the seductress trope, which goes all the way back to like Delilah in the Bible, Delilah and Samson, if you know that story. So Samson is this very strong warrior and soldier who holds all his strength in his hair and in his, I guess, locks or something like that. And essentially he like beats whole armies by himself. Because that's how strong he is, and his enemies devise a plan to use Delilah to seduce him, and so then she, of course, you know, beds him and stuff like that, and then when he's asleep, cuts off his hair so that he can be defeated, right? So this idea that this trope that women are essentially the downfall of a strong man, right? This has always been a trope, like biblical trope, all the way since like even before Delilah, Adam and Eve, like Eve is the downfall of man, right? You know, because she made Adam eat the apple, right? Adam eat the apple. But also the seductress characters, it's funny how they have been sort of like turned on their head as time goes on, like especially in like film noir movies, where they have been sort of become known as like the femme fatale characters. And so these characters can be seen in like Batman, right? Batman is a film noir. People forget that Batman is like a noir, like superhero comic book series, where like he is the detective, right? And he deals with all of, you know, Catwoman is a seductress, right? Poison Ivy is a seductress, but people have come to like they've been portrayed more strongly and more defiantly and more like, and so they have become like female characters that people actually like and look up to and find strength in, which is very interesting. That they have been turned, the seductress character has been turned from this shameful thing into this thing that has sort of been seen as like women empowerment, right? Also, I'm talking about identity, right? So identity in terms of sexual identity, also talking about superheroes as well. Superheroes have always had sort of a homoeroticism to them, in terms of like these sort of through lines and themes of like coming to terms with one identity, having two separate identities, one where you have to hide who you are and one where you can truly be yourself, right? These are like all homoerotic themes, you know, dealing with queer communities, right? Because there has not been a lot of like queer literature, because a lot of the literature people have not been able to be, until now, open about their sexuality because it's been seen as taboo, or, you know, is seen in sort of like more religious circles as sinful, right? As something that is not accepted. So a lot of things have been sort of queer coded in a way. I know a lot of like Disney villains have been queer coded as well. Ursula was literally designed after a drag queen. You look at all of our like Jafar, Scar. You go back and watch any of the Disney movies, most of them are like queer coded characters, a lot of the old Disney films. And it's interesting because they're usually always queer coded as the bad guys. Like, so those queer coded natures are put on all the bad guys. So this idea that queerness is inherently evil. But it's funny because a lot of like queer communities really like have taken these characters and sort of seen them as like, you know, good representation, even though like they were queer coded for nefarious reasons and bad reasons to like depict these oh well, this character's evil because they are flamboyant and act this way, right? But a lot of those queer communities have like taken on those characters as their own. Like they personally find them to be good and they find refuge in them, and it's very interesting, the dynamic and how that works, and how like something that was used to do something nefarious then sort of gets taken by those communities as a form of strength. Like now, like Ursula, Cruella de Vil, all these characters that are sort of queer coded, they're iconic. But yeah, that'll be it. I don't want this to be too long, but a quick, fast course in a lot of these topics, very heavy topics, at the end of the semester that hopefully you can take and think about as you are doing your final exam essay. But yeah, that'll be it for this video, and I'll see y'all. Actually, I won't see you all, but I hope you have a wonderful end of the year. Hopefully it's not too stressful. But yeah, it's been nice taking over as your teacher and doing this. But yeah, hopefully I'll see you around sometime.